Hello everyone. Welcome back to our weekend Bible study series on the book of Nehemiah. Tonight, we begin part 4. Last week, we were finishing up chapter 2, and at this point in the book, Nehemiah and his traveling party had been in Jerusalem for just a few days. They rested for 3 days, and then Nehemiah wasted no time in getting to work. Nothing more is mentioned about the military escort the king provided. Maybe they returned to Shushan, or maybe they went on to patrol the nearby regions of the Persian Empire before returning home. We don't know. We're just not told. I don't think they stayed with Nehemiah because if there would have been a military presence there, Sanballat, Tobiah, and the other detractors wouldn't have been such a threat to the people when they began building the wall. They may have wished they could have had a military support, but they didn't. They had to defend themselves while trusting on God to protect them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So last week, I was talking about 7 of Nehemiah's leadership qualities, and I left off with the 5th one. Well, here's a quick review of the first 5 we already covered. Number 1 was vision. Number 2 was courage. Number 3 was integrity. Number 4 was humility. And number 5 was strategic planning. Before Nehemiah left Shushan, he had 3 months or so, which he spent praying, fasting, and preparing for this big mission in Jerusalem. We can assume he spent a great deal of time in meditation. Now that word meditation can be an awkward, religious-sounding word that's often associated with transcendentalism. But don't be put off by the meditation word. Here's a better definition from dictionary.com. Meditation is, quote, continued or extended thought, reflection, contemplation. It basically means focusing on something and giving it a lot of thought. And that leads us to the 6th leadership quality, which is focus. Clearly, Nehemiah was focused on the problem facing Jerusalem. He saw it not only as a problem for the people of Judah, but he focused on the fact that the absence of a wall with sturdy gates as the main means of defense for the temple in the immediate vicinity was a reproach to God. It was an insult and a disgrace that the city bearing his name was in such shabby disrepair. It was a source of scoffing for the surrounding detractors as well. It was a poor reflection on God. And the 7th leadership quality Nehemiah possessed was cooperation. Being a prestigious member of the palace court in service to the king, he had to cooperate with people on many different levels, from entry-level servants or slaves to royalty of the highest level. Working with so many different categories of people couldn't have worked for a narcissistic egomaniac. Furthermore, we know that he was well-liked and trusted to have been so successful in his career. When they headed to Jerusalem, he cooperated with the military escort and the men who accompanied his brother from Jerusalem. When they arrived in Jerusalem, there had to be cooperation with the temple leaders and those who lived in the city and worked on the wall. And these are just 7 of Nehemiah's impressive leadership qualities. And these character traits are pretty generic for all leaders. They're basically building blocks that we can impress upon ourselves, our kids, and our grandkids. When you take these characteristics and add to them the godly attributes of wisdom and the fruits of the Holy Spirit, you've got the makings of what God wants us all to be. So this book, Nehemiah, isn't just the historical account of how the wall around the Second Temple was built. It's about that, of course, but it also shows us how we can be better people, better followers of God, better Christians with desirable leadership characteristics, which non-believers may see as brightly shining lights. As we read further into Nehemiah's life and times, we'll get to know him even better, and we'll be able to identify even more of his admirable attributes. It's no wonder Nehemiah is such a commendable example of leadership among motivational experts. So let's move on to chapter 3. The actual building process begins in this chapter. Nehemiah knew what needed to be done. He was a visionary, after all, and we can see his organizational skills in play here. We can see that Nehemiah did his homework on how to best utilize the workers, and he placed the people in a methodical way so that the right people would be working on the right projects where they would be most effective. He made sure everyone on the project had the common vision of what needed to be done. And now might be a good time to Google a map of Nehemiah's wall so that we too can share his vision of a completed wall and where the various gates were located. Now, I'm not going to read the 32 verses in chapter 3 because it would be as agonizing for you as it would be for me as I brutally mispronounced all these Hebrew names. And it would be an editing nightmare for Gary to make it right. So you might want to hit the pause button and read through chapter 3 right now. And as you read it, look on the map you Googled and so you can see where all the gates are located. And I'll be back on the other side of chapter 3. And this would be as good a place as any to take a short break. Here's Gary.
Most Christians have no idea how the greatest of Jewish holidays became the greatest of Christian holy days. Ronald Dart's second book, The Thread, God's Appointments with History, is now available from Amazon.com or directly from borntowin.net. For more information, write to Born to Win, Post Office Box 560, White House, Texas 75791, or call toll-free 1-888-BIBLE-44.
Okay, we all just read chapter 3, and I hope you all did an excellent job pronouncing all those Hebrew names. Or did you just skip over them? Come on now, be honest. Some years ago, I was listening to a Bible study by Beth Moore. I can't remember what book she was covering, but she was going over a whole bunch of names, like a genealogy or something. But I remember her telling the audience to make sure they say each name because God inspired the author to include each one of those names. And I think she made a good point. Now, there are just a few comments I have regarding some of the verses in chapter 3. In verse 1, Eliashib, the high priest, is the grandson of Joshua or Jeshua, who is the first high priest who served when Zerubbabel came from Babylon to rebuild the temple. And you can read about him in Ezra 3. It's significant that Eliashib should be mentioned first and would be instrumental in building the sheep gate, not only because of his grandfather's role in rebuilding the temple, but this gate was where the sacrificial sheep would pass through to get to the sacrificial altar. Another verse that stands out is verse 5, which says this: "The next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors." End quote. Now, Tekoa was a city or a region of Judah about 10 miles north of Jerusalem. Now, the commoners of Tekoa, the rank-and-file citizens, they did what was expected of them when it came to working on the wall. But the city leaders, or nobles as they're called here, they weren't interested in doing the work, the physical labor that was necessary, nor did they want to take orders from the job supervisors. Sounds to me like there might have been a little pride or arrogance problem with these guys. Maybe they thought a little too highly of themselves to do all that manual labor. Whatever their problem, they weren't setting a good example to the people in the community or to any of the people who were working on that project. Well, how did Nehemiah handle that? Well, Nehemiah was a gracious man, and he was a gentleman. He didn't call them out or chide them publicly, at least that we know of, and he certainly didn't refer to them rudely in any way in his book. But the fact that he even wrote about their non-participation Seems like it must have been an ignominious footnote against them in the annals of Jewish history. But Nehemiah was smart. He wasn't going to be bothered by these Tekoan no-shows, so he just ignored them. Stephen Cole of Bible.org says this about that. Quote, "The difficult thing about motivating a group of people is that what motivates some turns off others. Even Nehemiah couldn't get the nobles of Tekoa to join in the project. One wise way that Nehemiah motivated the people was to assign many of them to work on the portion of the wall that they had particular interest in. The priests worked on the sheep gate, where the people could bring sacrifices to the temple, and others repaired the wall in front of their own homes. They had a personal incentive to do a good job." End quote. As a leader and a job superintendent, he realized that forced labor isn't nearly as productive as a volunteer workforce. Not sure if you noticed in verse 20 of chapter 3 the subtle praise of Nehemiah that he offered to Baruch. Let's notice that. Here's what he said. "Next to him, Baruch, son of Zabbai, zealously repaired another section, from the angle to the entrance of the house of Eliashib the high priest." Now this may seem like a little thing, but hey, it's recorded here, so it must be important, right? Nehemiah recognized the value of praise when someone was doing a good job. On-the-job praise from your boss means the world to you, doesn't it? Nehemiah knew this principle from first-hand experience, no doubt, don't you think? You know that the king must have complimented him for doing a good job, and if not in words, then certainly in deeds. Look at all the king bestowed on Nehemiah for this trip to Jerusalem. And isn't this exactly what we're living for? No, not just in the here and now, but when it's all said and done, standing before God, we desperately want to hear, "Well done, you good and faithful servant." Well, one thing you probably noticed when reading chapter 3 is that Nehemiah built all of the wall and the gates simultaneously, not just one section at a time. And that makes perfect sense because it was being built to keep out the bad guys. And that's a fairly good segue into the next chapter, chapter 4, as we'll soon see. Chapter 4 deals with opposition and how to deal with it. Verse 1 says, "When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed." He became angry, all right. The Hebrew word for anger in this verse is kara, if that's how you pronounce it, which means burning with anger or blazing hot with anger. Maybe he didn't let on outwardly that he was so angry, because at this point he just resorts to mocking the Jews as if their work was purely a waste of time. Verse 2, "He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, 'What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?' Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, 'What they are building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones.'" So the ridicule and the mocking must have continued, and it probably wasn't isolated. They've made the rounds of the wall and jeered and scoffed at all the workers. And then in verse 4, Nehemiah started praying. Verse 4, "Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." Now wait a minute. What's with that prayer? That doesn't sound very nice. Aren't we supposed to bless those who persecute you? bless and do not curse like Paul told us in Romans 12:14? And what about Luke 6:28, where Jesus himself instructed us to bless those that curse you and pray for those who mistreat you? Jesus also told us in Matthew 5:44, "But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Now, is this just the Old Covenant versus the New Covenant, or what? Some might easily say this is a contradiction. But is it really? How do we explain this? Well, there are different jurisdictions throughout the Bible. What do I mean by that? There are actually different levels of governance or jurisdictions that God established in the Bible. 4 of them, actually, and here's what they are: the individual, the family, civil government, and the church. And not all laws necessarily apply to all 4 of them. Now, let me give you an example. Individuals are to conduct themselves as Jesus instructed us in the scriptures that I mentioned. Love your enemies, bless those that curse you, etc. And like Paul instructed us in the 12th chapter of Romans, he was telling us how individuals should react when dealing with other individuals. But in the very next chapter, chapter 13 of Romans, Paul writes about the responsibilities of civil governments, such as law enforcement, the judicial system, capital punishment, collecting taxes, and so on. The 2 different jurisdictions of individuals and civil governments, that's the most obvious, and hopefully that can help us to see the difference between Nehemiah's prayer and the prayers Jesus was talking about. Nehemiah wasn't praying about someone who had offended him personally. He was crying out to God because they were close to being under attack by neighboring enemies. And they were impeding the work which God had commissioned them to do. David's prayers for his enemies are even more severe than Nehemiah's prayer. Read Psalms 35 when you have a chance. David asked God to do some serious damage to his enemies. He was praying for deliverance, just like Nehemiah was. We can offer up the same kind of prayers for deliverance without being in violation of what Jesus taught about blessing those who curse you, and so on. It's perfectly acceptable to ask God to deal with the wickedness in your community or in government or wherever it may be, or to pray for the end of abortion. In fact, I think God expects us to pray that he would deal with wickedness that affects us. Okay, let's move on to verse 6. Nehemiah 4:6. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. In other words, they continued working. The building never stopped. They kept right on doing the work. Verse 7. Nehemiah 4:7. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs of Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. As a matter of fact, they were livid. Verse 8. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. So apparently Sanballat, Tobiah, and the others thought all their mocking and scoffing at the Jews was going to be enough to shut down the work. The intimidation didn't work. So now they're threatening a fight. And what's their problem? What is their problem? What difference should it make to them if Nehemiah builds a wall around Jerusalem and the temple? Why can't they just let them be? Well, you may or may not follow politics, but the problem here is exactly the same as what's going on with the Washington, D.C. establishment. The establishment. They're the ones who are in power, and they make all the rules and control the flow of money. They're the good old boys who aren't about to give up their power to anybody. The establishment is apoplectic at the mere thought of an outsider coming in and upsetting the status quo, and they'll do whatever it takes to make sure they keep their positions of power. Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Philistines were the establishment of Nehemiah's time, and they weren't about to let go of their power and influence over that part of their domain. The corruption back then is just like the corruption we see today. Nothing ever really changes. Verse 9, "But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Meanwhile, the people of Judah said, 'The strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall.' Also our enemies said, 'Before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them, and we will kill them and put an end to the work.' Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, 'Wherever you turn, they will attack us.'" The threat of hostilities were starting to take a toll on a lot of the Jews there. They were working hard from dawn till dark. They were tired, and the last thing they wanted was strife or bloodshed. Notice what Nehemiah did to shore up the frightened workers. Verse 13, "Therefore I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, 'Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes.'" I think it's safe to assume Nehemiah and his team of wall builders weren't pacifists, nor were they new to the concept of self-defense. They didn't have to go out and get new weapons for this new threat. They already had the weapons. Nehemiah told them to remember that God was with them and instructed them to fight for their loved ones if they were attacked. They weren't just supposed to sit back and allow themselves to be slaughtered. Verse 15, "When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to do our own work." Verse 16, "From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. Then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, 'The work is extensive and spread out, and we're widely separated from each other along the wall. Whenever you hear the sound of a trumpet, join us there. Our God will fight for us.' So we continued the work with half the men holding spears from the first light of dawn till the stars came out. At that time I also said to the people, 'Have every man and his helper stay inside Jerusalem at night so they can serve as guards by night and workers by day.' Neither I nor my brothers, nor my men, nor the guards with me took off our clothes. Each had his weapon, even when he went for water." And that's the end of chapter 4. Next week, we'll take a closer look at chapter 4, and we'll see what we can take away from this chapter. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and email me at richg@borntowin.net. That's richg@borntowin.net. And be sure to tell us where you live. So, until next week, this is Rich Glasgow saying, keep your powder dry.